Hi, boys and girls. It's time to read our last chapter in Lassie Come Home. Today is Thursday, May the 7th, and you've just recently read where Lassie has made it home. She's had quite a dangerous, exciting adventure, and she spent some time with Raleigh and wound up saving his life. Those were some great chapters, weren't they? And then in this last chapter, it's one of my favorites, chapter 21, where she finally makes it home and where Sam fights for Lassie to be able to stay with Joe because he realizes that she belongs to them and that's who she's loyal to. And how the Duke turned his head the other way and realized also that Lassie really belonged to Joe. And it's so exciting that the Duke came to offer Sam a job because we know that that's a job that will last and that he'll be able to keep. So the Duke was loyal as well in his own way. And so now we get to read the final chapter, chapter 22, just like old times again. When young Joe Carracloth said that you wouldn't have recognized his dog in a few days, he was right or wrong, according to what you thought his dog ought to look like. Certainly, if you had looked for the screw-eared, gay-tailed horror that his father had coped up in his simple attempt to save the dog for his son, and yet not trespass upon his stern codes of honesty, you would have never recognized it. But if you had looked for that proud, graceful, slim-headed dog known as Sam Carraclough's Lassie, you would have found her. There she was, and as the weeks passed under careful feeding and correct treatment, she slowly blossomed back into the dog she had once been. The gauntness and the pinched flanks disappeared, and the years of proper care that had built a strong constitution aided her now. Once more the rich coat billowed in black sable and white, making her a delight to the eye. There was left only a slight limp where the bullet had creased her flank. The muscles had stiffened, and try as Sam Carraclough would, even with all his secrets and magics, he could never quite cure that. But he did well with it, and massaged and rubbed the dog's muscles until the limp was so slight that only a dog expert would have noticed the tiny favoring of that foot as the dog went along. To the eye of all except the most expert dogman, she would have been that most beautiful thing, a perfect collie. And each weekday, a few minutes before 4 o'clock, once again the shopkeepers of Greenall Bridge would look out and see that proud dog going down the street and say, "You can set your clocks by her." And always, not long after, Joe Carraclough would come out of school and greet his dog, and they would go home together happily. Yet, when young Joe promised the Duke that the dog would always be waiting for him, he was wrong there, too. For there came a time when Lassie appeared no more at the school gate. Strangely enough, however, Joe didn't seem to care. He seemed perfectly happy, with a sort of secret happiness, as he went home alone. It was one of those days as he went, whistling to himself, that as he came along the graved path of the Duke's grounds, he saw the girl again. Somehow Joe felt sorry for her. She did not look nice and plump and solid-boned as the little girls of the village did. "Hello," he said. "Hello," she answered. There seemed nothing else to say, but he stood there. "I've been away at school," she said. "Have you?" "Yes, but it's holidays now." He thought gravely about that. "We don't have our holidays for another week," he announced. There was another pause, and then she said, "How is Lassie?" Joe smiled his warm smile. He looked around as if to make sure no one was listening. "You can come and see," he said, as if conferring a favor. He led the way down the path to the cottage where the hollyhocks, gay-colored and tall, grew beside the white wall. He opened the door. "Mother," he said, "I'm going to show her." "Why, do come in, miss," his mother said, smoothing her apron, and then wiping an imaginary piece of dust from the white tablecloth set for tea. Joe led the way to the cool scullery where a great low box was set in the dimness. And in the box was Lassie, and piled about her were 7 plump sleeping balls of fur. "You see," Joe explained proudly, "we keep her here because she'd fret in the kennels. That's because she's a home dog, Lassie is." The girl couched down and touched one ball of fur with her forefinger. The little thing gave a drunken hiccup. "Are they still blind?" she asked as they both laughed. Joe expanded. Of course not. Why, they get their eyes open when they're 10 days old. These are over 3 weeks old now. They can run, only they like to sleep, most of the time, it seems to me. He smiled at Lassie, lifted her head. He stroked it gently. You know a lot about them, don't you? The girl asked humbly. Well, she had a litter once before, Joe disclaimed, and I remember from that time. This is just like old times, isn't it, Lassie? He crouched there, looking at his dog. It was like old times. He had often thought about that of late. After the girl had gone and polite goodbyes and invitations to come and see the puppies again had been issued, Joe was still thinking about that. It was almost as if he was going to discover some sort of answer about life that as a boy he had never reached before. This was like old times, although, of course, it was a different house that they lived in now. It was as it used to be a year or so ago in so many ways. For example, if he took an extra big spoonful of sugar on his oatmeal in the morning, no longer did his mother snap at him and say, "Now be careful, young man. Sugar costs money." Or if he came in from the raw Yorkshire air boasting of how hungry he was, no longer did his mother's face take on that frightened secret look, but instead she would laugh in her merry plump way and say, "My goodness, I don't know how to keep you full. Where do you put it all?" But all the time she was saying it, her voice would sound as if she were proud of a son who had such a great appetite. And that was just as it used to be in old times, too. No longer did the grown-ups stop talking when he came in suddenly, nor did the voices go on lifting and falling in weary argument after he was abed. No longer did his father come home each day weary and dour and unspeaking to sit by the fire and gaze into it. Instead, the moment his footstep would sound out on the gravel, Mrs. Carraclough would jump up in a great bustle and cry, "Look out! Here comes thy father now! Heads up! Hot stuff coming!" Then she would race from fire to table, whisking steaming tureens and bowls from the oven, as if the most important thing in all the world was that they should all be set out in that brief space of time between the sound of his coming and the opening of the door. Then she would stand her arms akimbo and say, "Hurry up and wash, Sam. Sheep's head and dumplings tonight, and they don't wait for no man." That was the way it was, like old times again. And his father, too, sitting at the table, bowing his head to the food and then looking up and saying, "Well, and how's our Joe been today? Did you do your lessons good at school?" Once it had been like that before. Then it had all stopped. Now it was like that again. What was the reason? Joe pondered over this all through the meal that evening. After the meal was over and Lassie came stalking in, he sank on the rug beside her and stroked her, and he thought he had found the answer. It was Lassie. Of course that was it. When she had been home, things had been right. When she was sold and gone, nothing had gone right any more. And now that she was back, everything was fine again, and they were all very happy. She came home and brought us luck, he thought. She did it. She came home and brought us luck. He made a crooning sound and pillowed his face in the dog's ruff. Lassie sighed contentedly. Then his mother spoke. "Now, Joe, don't lie with that dog all over my rug. Getting hair all over, and what's making you so silent tonight?" Joe smiled to himself. He still crooned to the dog. "You're a come-home dog, aren't you, Lassie?" he crooned. "Aye, that ye are. And you brought us luck, 'cause you're a come-homer. You're my come-home. Lassie come-home. That's thy name. Lassie come-home." But his mother stormed again. "Did you hear me, Joe Carraclough? Now thou'll have her all upset, and when she's got a litter to take care on. Thou should know better nor that." Joe edged an inch away from the fire and stroked the contented Lassie. He looked up gravely. "Eh, feyther," he said, "I can feel her ribs." His father turned his chair to the hearth and stretched his legs luxuriously, and then began lighting his pipe, smiling to himself. "Don't you think she's a bit poor, father?" Joe went on anxiously. "I think she could stand a little more beef and a little less milk." "Ah, you do you?" his mother chattered on as she piled up the steaming dishes she was washing. "Is that so? You think she could stand more beef? Aye, well, thou wouldn't be a Carraclough nor a Yorkshireman if thou didn't think thou knew more about raising tykes nor breaking eggs with a stick. Aye, sometimes it seems to me that some folk in this village think more of their tykes nor they do of their own flesh and blood. Dogs, dogs, dogs. After this litter's raised, out she goes where she belongs, and never another dog will I have in my home." Just then Joe looked up at his father, who was looking down out of the side of his eyes, and his father lifted his hand and put his finger comically beside his nose. That secret gesture had a meaning. It meant you mustn't mind women too much, Joe. They have a hard time of it staying home and scrubbing and scouring and cooking all day, and so they take it out in scolding, and we've got to let them do it to blow off steam. But we know it doesn't really mean anything. We men know that, we men. And as his father smiled and Joe grinned, and then it was so funny, this new kinship of men that let women go on scolding, that Joe started to laugh. And his laughter rose and rose until his mother turned. "Ah, and now you laugh at me, do ye? Well, I'll teach ye. I'll give ye a scalp." And she flicked him with the dish towel expertly till Joe rolled over. "I wasn't laughing at you, Mother." "Well, what were you laughing at?" "At Father. He made a funny face." Mrs. Carraclough turned on her husband. "So were thee, eh? Well, I'll scalp thee too." But as she advanced, Joe saw his father's great strong hands reach out, and one of them imprisoned his mother's shining wrists, and the other arm went round her great waist, and Mrs. Carraclough was held fast. Then the father looked at Joe and smiled. "Look at her, Joe. Who's the bonniest woman in the whole village?" "My mother is," Joe said stoutly, and with all the honesty in his heart. Mrs. Carraclough's face broke into a beam. "The two of ye," she said. "Ah, you're both chips off the same stick. You're both saying that to blarney me." "Nay," the lad answered an honest question honestly. "And another thing. Tha's bonny, and there's plenty of thee, too." "Oh, so tha thinks I'm plump. Well, let me go, Sam Carraclough. I've got to finish drying them dishes." But his father wouldn't let his mother go, and she began boxing his ears, and he just sat there with his head bowed to protect his pipe. Then they both laughed. That was just as it used to be long ago, too, his father and mother happy. Joe bowed his head to the dog and forgot them. "You're my lassie come home," he crooned. And that's the end. Boys and girls, I know you've enjoyed this book just like I have. I love reading it every year. And now our time with Lassie comes to a close.